May it please the court, counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. On May 1st, 2017, the defendant was given a blessing, a baby boy, a healthy, happy, innocent baby boy. Now that you have heard all of the evidence, it should be clear to you that the defendant didn't want the responsibility of that blessing, that she didn't accept the responsibility of that blessing, and that she let her blessing die a slow and painful and unnecessary death. And just as during Sterling's life, when the defendant took no responsibility for him, it's the same in his death. That's why we're here, because she doesn't take responsibility for his death. Actions and consequences, that's what this is about. You, as the jury, will soon be in the position to decide what her actions were and what are the consequences. Is it guilty? Is it not guilty? At this time, I'm going to go through some of the evidence with you. This is my chance, the state's chance, to walk through the evidence, to apply the law that you've just heard from the judge, and to make arguments about our case, and as to what makes sense, as to what's reasonable. You're going to hear that word a lot this morning, reasonable. The state has to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. It is our burden. We gladly take it on in every case, but remember what the definition for it is. If after a full and fair consideration of all of the evidence, you are firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt, then you have no reasonable doubt and you should find the defendant guilty. Okay? Firmly convinced. It does not mean beyond all doubt. It does not mean beyond any doubt. It does not mean beyond a shadow of a doubt. Don't hold the state to a higher standard that we do not have to meet. Are you firmly convinced? What's reasonable? Anything is possible, ladies and gentlemen, but that doesn't mean it's reasonable. We talked about that in jury selection. Right? Just because somebody throws out another theory or a possibility, that doesn't make it true. That doesn't make it that there's doubt. You have to look at what's reasonable. And reasonable doubt is based upon reason and common sense. You get to use your common sense. It's the kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act. Now be clear about that. Hesitation does not mean deliberation. When you go back in the jury room, you're going to talk to each other. You're going to discuss the facts. Some of you may disagree on things. You may go back and forth. That is not hesitation, that's deliberation. You are supposed to deliberate as a jury. You are supposed to go through that process. When it talks about this phrase of the kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act, that's when you get to the end conclusion. That's when you get to that point where you're saying guilty or not guilty. Okay, it's at that point that if you're hesitating, you don't know, you don't think that guilty is right, that's your hesitation, not deliberation. It's your job to deliberate. A reasonable doubt is one that fairly and naturally arises from the evidence or the lack of evidence. Now look at that phrase, fairly and naturally arises. You don't go looking for reasonable doubt. Based on reason and common sense, and it's not the mere possibility of innocence. You are truth seekers, not doubt seekers. There's 2 counts in this case. You've heard from the jury instructions that each one must be decided on its own merits. Now you also heard in the jury instructions that you do not have to agree on a fact or a theory. The only thing you have to agree on is the end conclusion of that. So if you get back in the jury room and someone says, well, I find that the particular acts that she did in this case are 1, 2, and 3, and somebody else says, well, I find the particular acts that she did in this case are A, B, and C, it doesn't matter as long as you're still coming to the end conclusion that those acts make her guilty. Right? So you do not have to agree to all of the facts. It's just your verdict that you have to agree on. Consider evidence using your observations, your common sense, your experience. Again, you're seeing that word, common sense. Try to reconcile any conflicts in the evidence, but if you cannot, you accept the evidence that you find more believable. Right, this isn't one of those things where you say, well, these two things conflict, so I'm just going to throw out my hands and walk away from it and not make a decision. If these two things conflict, then you ask yourself, which one's more reasonable? Which one's more believable? And that's where you go to. There are lesser included offenses in this case. With lesser included offenses, you start at the top. If you find the defendant guilty at the top, then don't bother going to the rest of them. So when you're reading the elements, the jury instructions for count 1, murder in the first degree, and you go through those elements, and you have your deliberation, and you discuss it, and you all agree, guilty. Don't bother reading murder in the second degree, involuntary manslaughter. You don't even have to go to those. Just move on to the second count. So you start at the top, and then you don't need to go any further if you make a guilty decision on that. So what are the elements of murder in the first degree? And keep in mind, the elements in the case, that jury instruction, murder in the first degree, that's the only thing the state has to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Each one of those elements. During the time frame, May 1st, 2017, through and including August 30th, 2017, the defendant killed Sterling Cohen. Sterling was under the age of 14. The defendant acted with malice aforethought. The defendant was committing the offense of child endangerment. And his death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. This is what the state has to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's do the easiest element first, Sterling's age. We have to show that he was under the age of 14. Well, you all know that. Sterling's birthday is May 1st, 2017. On August 30th, 2017, Sterling was 3 months and 30 days old. Element number 2 is proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Nobody disputes this. It's that simple. That element is taken care of. Let's skip to element 4. To prove murder in the first degree, we have to prove that the defendant committed child endangerment. Child endangerment has its own definitions to it. We have to show that she was a parent and that she intentionally committed an act or series of acts using torture or cruelty, and the result to Sterling was bodily injury. Now keep this in mind. We do not have to prove that she intended bodily injury. All we prove is that she knew she was committing acts. She was aware of her acts. That her acts weren't an accident or a mistake. Right? That's the intentional part of it. The result of her acts was bodily injury. So, was she a parent? The parties have stipulated. DNA testing was done. There's no question. The defendant is the biological parent of Sterling Cohen. There's no dispute to that. Did she intentionally commit an act or series of acts using torture or cruelty? Okay, so let's break that down and first talk about what acts did she do? What acts did she commit in this case? The very first act, and you don't know when it happened. You don't know what day it was, what time of the day. But the very first act was when she chose to place him in that swing and face him towards the wall and walk out of that room and shut the door. That's her first act. It was a conscious decision on her part, and it continued over days, possibly over weeks, that he sat in that room. We don't know for sure when he went in there. We know the weekend of August 5th, her mother, the defendant's mother, said, well, he was a little thin, but he was okay. She took care of him that weekend. And after that, Sterling went home with the defendant. Did she that particular day put him in the room and leave him there? Did it take her a week before she put him in there? It doesn't matter, because we know he was put in there at some point during the month of August for an extended period of time. That act itself set off a chain of events that led to Sterling's death. What we also know is after that, thousands of acts occurred. Every minute, every hour of every day that Sterling sat in that room, the defendant committed acts. Every time that she chose to do something else besides care for her child was an act. It was a choice. Pick whichever one that you would like, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have to agree to them. You saw the photographs of the crime scene and the apartment that they all lived in. Every time that she went and put a movie in for Nala, but didn't go back and feed her baby, that was an act. Every time she went to turn on the air conditioner that's in the living room to keep themselves cool, while Sterling sat in the back room that felt 10 to 20 degrees hotter than the rest of the place, that was an act. Every time she sat herself on that couch to take a nap or to watch TV and didn't go and take care of her baby, that's an act. Every time she walked to the refrigerator and opened the door and fed herself and fed Nala and fed Zach with all the food that they had in their refrigerator, every time she did that and didn't feed her child, it was a choice. It was an act. Every time she was in that kitchen and did something else besides open up that cupboard door and mix the formula that was sitting right there and go feed her child, it was an act. Every time she walked into that bathroom that has an adjoining wall to Sterling's room, every time she went in there and took a shower and chose not to wash Sterling, chose not to clean him and change his diaper, that was an act. It was a choice. Every time she went in that bathroom to put on her makeup, to do her hair, to get the dog shampoo out of there, to take care of the dog, it was an act. She chose not to go take care of Sterling. Every time she went in her bedroom to lay in her bed to sleep, every time she placed Nala in the playpen, Nala, who had a bed, who had blankets, who had toys, every time she placed Nala in that crib and didn't go take care of Sterling, didn't hold him, didn't change him, didn't feed him, that was an act. Every time she turned on that fan that's facing Nala's bed to keep her cool, but left him suffering in that back room, that was an act. Every time she turned on the ceiling fan in the living room to keep her family cool and comfortable, while Sterling was dehydrating, while his organs were shutting down in that hot back room, every time she did that, that was an act. Every time she took a step in this tiny apartment and went somewhere else besides Sterling's bedroom to take care of him, it was an act. Her bedroom, you could take 2 steps from her bedroom and get right into Sterling's room. Her bedroom had an adjoining wall. This is a small apartment. She heard him scream. And she did nothing. How many days did he cry? Wanting food, wanting hydration, wanting to be touched, wanting to be changed. Is that why the mattresses were propped up against the wall? To prevent some of that sound coming through? Is that why the door was always shut, so she didn't have to hear it as loud as it would be with the door open? How many times did she ignore those cries? Now, you know the cries stopped after a while because he was too ill. He was too frail. He didn't have the energy to cry anymore. But there was a time where Sterling cried and cried and cried, and nobody took care of him. And every time she ignored that, that was a choice, it was an act. Now we have to look at were the acts intentional. Okay? Now this is not in the sense of were the acts intentional with any type of specific intent. Okay? Like I said, the result is bodily injury. We don't have to show that she intended physical harm to Sterling. We just have to show she knew what she was doing. That's the only thing that you get to use Dr. O'Hara's testimony for. Was she aware of her actions? Were her actions not an accident? That's the only thing that you're considering. So how do we know that they were intentional? Because she knew Sterling was not being cared for. She knew every time she walked by his room and didn't go in there was a time that he wasn't being fed. It was a time that he wasn't being changed. Right? You knew from Zach Cohen's testimony he had nothing to do with Sterling. He didn't change diapers, he didn't go in that room, he didn't think Sterling was his, and he didn't care. Cheyanne was fully aware that she was the sole provider for Sterling, that she was the only person who could give Sterling the care that he needed, and she chose not to do it. She was aware that she was not doing that. She knew he needed help. Anyone who saw that child, who heard that child, who looked at that child during that time frame would know that he needed help. You wouldn't even have to see him to know he needed help. Everybody knows, I don't care what level your education is, everybody knows a baby needs to be fed. A baby needs hydration. A baby needs a diaper change. Right? She knew he needed her help, and she knew he was dying. Because again, that's just common sense. If you don't feed your baby, they don't live. What you know from the evidence is that within a 26-day period, Sterling went from thin, maybe being underfed at that point, maybe not being taken care of very well, but still taken care of, to starving to death. Look at the last photo of Sterling. It was taken on July 15th, 2017, to the facial photo at the autopsy. Any person in that apartment would know that this child needed help, would know that their actions of doing other things and not helping Sterling is an action that's helping lead to his death. So did she intentionally commit a series of acts using torture or cruelty? Now again, the intentional part of this is not that she thought in her head, I'm going to be cruel. I'm going to torture my child, so I'm not going to feed him and I'm not going to change his diapers. That's not what we're talking about here. Was she aware that she was doing acts, leaving him in that room, not feeding him, not bathing him? And was the result of that torture or cruelty to Sterling? Right? There's no legal definition for these. You don't have a legal instruction on what these mean. So you use your common sense. Here's a common sense definition. Torture, infliction of pain, abuse, ill treatment, maltreatment. Seems relevant to this case. Cruelty, callous indifference to pain and suffering. So what did we have here? What evidence supports the torture and cruelty in this case? The photos and the testimony of the first responders. The state knows that those photos are not enjoyable to look at. But those photos show so many things in this case, and we'll talk about some of the other things later, but one of the things that they do show is the torture and cruelty of what Sterling had to endure during August of 2017. And the testimony of the first responders talking about what they saw, what they felt. And Dr. Klein and Dr. Hunting's testimony. So what do we have with these? The room was oppressively hot. Everyone said it. Now the temperature that they took what, 8 hours later in that room was 81 degrees. Everybody testified, though. It felt much hotter than that. And you also know that at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the afternoon in August, when first responders got there, it was hotter than the temperature they took that evening. It was oppressively hot, not appropriate for anyone to be sitting in. No air. Tom Friedrich called the sheriff because something was not right. She didn't know any of the facts of the case. She didn't know who these people were, but when she walked in that room and she saw Sterling, she knew immediately something was not right. The smell was so bad, Jason Russell had to hold his breath. Layers of soaked blankets and clothing around Sterling, a diaper full of sewage, exposed, raw skin, hunger and dehydration, never being touched or held. Think about that. You know, the things that are in our face in this case was that he starved, that he died of thirst, that he died of infection. But think about the fact that this baby, Sterling, was never touched or held. All babies need that. All human beings need that. And he sat in that room and he cried for someone to come get him. And he cried for someone to feed him. And all he needed was somebody to touch him and to pick him up and to bathe him and to love him and to care for him. And it never happened. Never touched or held during that time. Now, how do you know that? Because of Dr. Huntington. Right? The maggots would not have been there had he been moved. That's how you know that Sterling was never moved, never touched, despite the obvious diaper and those types of things. Dr. Huntington talked about the life cycle of the maggots, and one of the things the maggots do is when they're done feeding, they crawl away to pupate. And we found that in the blankets and on the swing. And you see that in the picture where the maggots started pupating. Had Sterling been moved, picked up, like she said she did the night before? Do you remember that in her interview? She said that she changed his diaper the night before, picked him up. Okay, had that happened, you wouldn't have seen this type of evidence where it was. You also know that these maggots were feeding on his feces and skin. They were crawling on his body. Had he been moved or touched or bathed or anything during the life cycle of a maggot, none of that evidence would have been there. Dr. Huntington talked about the scuttlefly, how it's able to complete its life cycle in 9 to 13 days. This is where we get the time frame, right? Now you add a day, because the fly has to get to that food source in the first place. So give that fly the time to get into the house, to get into the bedroom, to get into Sterling's diaper, to start feeding. You've got 10 to 14 days that we know that he sat there, not moving, not being touched, not being bathed, and who knows how often being fed, because we know it wasn't very much, and at the end it was probably nothing. And as he laid there, he had maggots crawling on his skin. Is that torture itself? Think about that. Being completely helpless, not being able to move, and having bugs crawling all over you, while you're in pain from hunger and thirst, feeding on your feces and your dying skin. It's almost beyond imagination, the torture and the cruelty that that baby went through during the last few weeks of his life. And this all happened while he was still alive. You know, maybe some of you in the beginning of this case, when you heard maggots, you thought, well, he died and they left him in the swing for a long time, and that's why there's maggots. Well, you know now from the evidence that's not the case. Right? Dr. Klein said based on the Riger, Sterling could have been dead for up to 8 hours. Maybe a day. Because had he been dead longer, he would have looked differently. He would have been bloated. The Riger, he would have been stiff. It would have gone away by that point. Right? He had just died. Dr. Huntington talked about facultative myiasis, infestation of the living. And that's what he saw in this case. Had Sterling been dead for an extended period of time, there would have been blowfly infestation, not scuttlefly infestation. He also would have seen the flies in Sterling's nose and his ears and things like that. It would have looked different. So Dr. Huntington can tell you from the insects that he was only dead a half day to a day. And the entire rest of that time, he was alive, going through a painful, horrendous death while two adults were in another room. This was torture. This was cruel. There's absolutely no question about this. The defendant's intentional act or series of acts of torture and cruelty resulted in bodily injury. Well, of course it resulted in bodily injury. Sterling died. Okay, bodily injury is any physical pain, illness, or impairment. If somebody hits you and you say, ouch, that's bodily injury. So again, there's no question on this. There's no need to discuss it any further. So element 4, child endangerment, is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Element 1, death. Sterling died. If the defendant's actions caused or directly contributed to Sterling's death, then the defendant killed Sterling. All right, this case is a little different than most murder cases we do. This isn't someone picking up a gun and putting a bullet through somebody's head. This isn't someone in a moment of rage taking their baby and shaking them and causing brain damage and they die. Right? This is an extended period of time, but her actions still caused and directly contributed to Sterling's death. But for her actions, he would be alive today. Every time she chose to do something else besides care for Sterling was an act that caused or directly contributed to Sterling's death. When she put him in that room and faced him towards that wall, and she walked out and she shut the door, that was an act that caused or directly contributed to Sterling's death. There are two adults in that apartment. Both of those adults had the moral and legal duty to care for Sterling. And neither one of them took it on. Okay? The defendant is not excused from this responsibility because she was too tired, or she wasn't feeling well, or she supposedly had depression, or because she chose to do drugs. She does not get excused from this because of her choices. Element 1, she is responsible for his death. Now, element 3, malice aforethought. Malice is a state of mind which leads one to intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of another out of actual hatred or with an evil purpose or with an unlawful purpose. You see that you have alternatives here. Again, you don't have to agree on which one you pick, but if you pick one and everybody agrees that's malice, then you're fine. Malice may be found from an actual hatred or by a fixed or deliberate intent to do injury. Malice may be found from the acts and conduct of the defendant and the means used in doing the wrongful and injurious acts. And it doesn't have to exist for any length of time. Let's break it down. Did the defendant intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of Sterling out of actual hatred? That's one of the alternatives. Well, she told Dr. Denner Sterling was the reason her family was messed up. And she blamed him for their problems. Zach didn't believe Sterling was his son, and he had nothing to do with him. And you saw from the evidence what you heard about her history, she always left her family for Zach. He came first, always. Sterling was interfering with her relationship, her happiness, her life. So at that time, did she have an actual hatred for Sterling? Is it unreasonable to think that with what she did? Another alternative, does she intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of Sterling with an evil or an unlawful purpose? What else do you call what happened to Sterling? Anything but evil. How can her allowing Sterling to die an extended, painful death in her own home where she had things to take care of him, everything she needed to take care of him, because she couldn't be bothered with feeding, or bathing, or changing diapers, or changing clothes, or because she wanted to please Zach, because she wanted things to go back the way they were before Sterling was born? How could that be anything but unlawful or evil? We have child endangerment laws for a reason. We put laws on the books to protect children because they cannot protect themselves. We all have a duty to take care of our children. Sometimes we have a duty to take care of other people's children because they cannot take care of themselves, especially when it's an infant. Right? Everything that she did with him is unlawful. You may also find malice from the acts, conduct, and means used in doing the wrongful and injurious acts. This is also why we showed you the pictures. These photographs scream malice. One of the things that they show is the nature of the injuries. What did her acts cause? They caused this. Sterling was a healthy baby, and by August of 2017, look at his ribs. Look at his skin and the pain that he went through. Those are malicious acts to let a child end up like that. He died of starvation. You know, Dr. Klein calls it malnutrition, and it's a much nicer word, but he died of starvation. He gained 5.5 ounces from birth to death. And you've seen some of the pictures in between where he had the chubby cheeks. He had put on weight. Okay, so that extreme weight loss came at the end when she chose not to feed him anymore. Dehydration, he died of thirst. His sunken eyes, his sunken face, the soft spot on his head was sunken. His whole body was shutting down because he wasn't receiving the hydration that he needed just to survive. Infection, he died of diaper rash. He died of diaper rash in a room that had clean diapers, in a room that had A&D ointment on the floor, with a baby bag, with diapers, with clean clothes. That's malicious. So that's the nature of the injuries. That's one way that you can find from the acts and the conduct, the malice. But you can also look at the mechanism of injury, the denial of critical care. Sterling was in a house that had formula. He was in a house that had running water and a bathtub that had bath toys in it for Nala, because she got baths, but Sterling didn't. He was in a room that had everything a baby needed: a clean bouncy swing, a clean blanket, baby bags, wipes, diapers, ointment, all of those things. But none of them were used. Denial of critical care. It's malicious. Here's the other thing to think about. She denied Sterling critical care. Okay? She made these choices to not do what she needed to do to keep him alive. But she made the effort to use her resources in that house to cover up the mess. Sterling is sitting in a swing that is soaked with urine and feces, probably dripping down to the floor. And what does she do? She starts stuffing clothing in a swing to soak it up. Isn't that reasonable as to why that clothing was there? There was onesies that could have been put on him to keep him clean. Instead, it was put in the swing to soak up urine. Blankets, feeties, the little mittens, a jacket. She took the time to do that, but she couldn't take the time to go fix a bottle. The smell in the room was horrendous. Instead of cleaning it up, instead of changing Sterling, she put air fresheners underneath his swing. Now, they had some questions about, well, you don't know who put it there. It could have been Nala. Maybe she was praying with them. Well, you heard from Zach King's testimony, believe that if you want, that Cheyanne did put him there because she didn't put him back. But you also know from the evidence that Nala did not go into that room. Okay, the princess wasn't allowed in that room. That's why the door was shut. Nala lived a completely separate life from Sterling. The defendant put those there because the smell was too bad. Now, was that to cover it up so maybe Zach didn't notice, so maybe the neighbors didn't notice? Or was that to cover it up for when she did walk in there and she didn't like the smell for her own convenience? Don't know. But she made all of this effort to cover up the mess instead of just cleaning up the mess and taking care of her child. That's malicious. That's malice. So we've talked about the nature of injuries, the mechanism of injury. The other thing is, Sterling's a child. He's 3 months and 30 days old. He could not care for himself. He could not protect himself. And that's who she chose to do this to. A completely helpless, innocent human being. That's who she chose to do this to. That's malicious. Here's the easiest way to deal with malice. You can infer from the commission of child endangerment causing death that there was malice. So basically what that means is, if you find that she committed count 2, then you can have an inference. You can say that if she committed this particular crime, then she had to have had malice in this particular crime. Why? Because to have committed child endangerment causing death, it's just a given. You have to have malice to do that type of crime. So they allow you to make this very simple inference. It's that simple. So malice, element 3, whichever way you go with it, is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Element 5, extreme indifference to human life. Sterling's death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. This is a common sense definition. There's no legal definition for it. There's really not much need to talk about this because everything that we have gone through has shown that extreme indifference to human life. Sterling dying over a 10 to 14, at least a 10 to 14 day period in a swing, not being touched, not being fed, not being clothed with clothes that were sitting there in the room, not having a clean bouncy seat that was sitting there right beside him. Everything that happened to him, everything that she did was an extreme indifference to human life. These were not acts of careless neglect. These were not an accident. These were acts that no child should ever have to endure. And think about what he was experiencing the last few weeks of his life. The pain, the hunger, his organs shutting down, the bugs crawling on him, the crying. We don't know how babies' thought processes are, but we know they feel pain. We know when they need something, they ask us for it. These circumstances were extreme, they were indifferent, and they were in complete disregard of human life. No human should ever have to experience what Sterling did. So count 2. That's count 1. Murder in the first degree. Guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Count 2. Child endangerment resulting in death or causing death. What the state has to show, the elements for this. The defendant was the parent of Sterling. Sterling was under the age of 14 years. The defendant willfully deprived Sterling of the necessary food, water, health care, or supervision appropriate for a child of Sterling's age. The defendant was reasonably able to provide those things. And as a result, Sterling suffered substantial physical harm, and as a result, Sterling died. Now, willful deprivation. That's the one that's different than what we saw in some of the elements of murder first. But you still go back to the previous arguments that were just made. Okay? She told her own doctor she was tired of changing diapers. She was tired of hearing him cry. Any person who lived with Sterling would know that he desperately needed help. You know, she tried to claim in her interview that Sterling was fine the last few days of his life. That is not credible. You know that is not true. Okay? Element 3 is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. She made willful, conscious choices to not provide care to him. And was she reasonably able to provide that care? Absolutely. There was plenty of food in the refrigerator. She had water in her sink, in her bathtub. She had formula, bottles, diapers, wipes, clean clothes, ointment in the house. Everything was there. She had access to health care through Title 19. All she had to do was pick him up out of that swing and take him to the hospital. At some point during that time. Now, did she not want to do that because she let it go too far? She knew he looked too sick. She knew they were going to blame her for it. So she just left him in there, trying to cover up what she did. She went to the grocery store on August 26th. She had access to a car to go into the groceries. Her kitchen was full with chocolate milk and snacks for Nala and pop and chips. She was reasonably able to provide. They could afford a dog. Think about that. When you look at those crime scene photos, there is a half a bag of dog food sitting in their house, and a dog that was fed and well cared for, while Sterling lay rotting in that back room. They could afford drugs. Right? They had plenty of money for that. They earned $45,000 a year. Their rent was $330 a month. Sure, they had debts. Don't we all? That doesn't excuse not providing for him, and there's no evidence to show that she could not reasonably provide for his care. She knew how to care for a child. Nala was living proof of that. She raised Nala from an infant. She had her when she was a baby. She changed her diapers. She gave her bottles. And you heard during the interview how much she talked about Nala and all the things that she did with her as a baby. Because she knew how to care for a child. In her interview with Calloway, she described where the formula and the baby food were kept. She knew that. She described how much formula was in the can. She knew how much formula was in that can. She described how she mixed the formula. She described how Sterling would get louder when she wanted food. So she admitted she could hear him. She knew what he wanted when he cried. She was reasonably able to care for him. She described how she changed Nala's diaper the morning of August 30th. In her interview, she talked about how she had gotten up and changed Nala's diaper and put on a movie for her. She knows how to change diapers. Reasonably able to provide. She said that she knew when Sterling was uncomfortable because he would fuss. And then she said that's pretty much all he could do. So she fully recognized the fact that he was wholly dependent on her. And she was reasonably able to provide. Elements 5 and 6 in this, in the child endangerment, it's the same discussion that we had for causing the death in count 1. This was homicide, death at the hands of another, denial of critical care. It was death at the hands of his own mother. Elements 5 and 6, proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Death occurred, substantial physical harm. So did the defendant commit murder in the first degree, ladies and gentlemen? The defendant killed Sterling. Sterling was 3 months old. She acted with malice aforethought. She was committing the offense of child endangerment. His death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. Therefore, she is guilty of murder in the first degree. Did she commit child endangerment causing death? The defendant was the parent of Sterling. Sterling was 3 months old. The defendant willfully deprived Sterling of the necessary food, water, health care, or supervision. The defendant was reasonably able to provide those things, and as a result, Sterling suffered substantial physical harm. As a result, Sterling died. Therefore, the defendant is guilty of child endangerment causing death. It's that simple. Thank you for your time and attention.